I've been told to note that there are mics on the table, so please orient yourself towards them. It's my good pleasure to introduce Ruth Dassonneville, who is the Associate Professor in the Political Science Department at the University of Montreal, where she holds the Canada Research Chair in Electoral Democracy. She's a very highly regarded scholar of democratic behavior in institutions, and her research interests include electoral behavior, de-alignment, compulsory voting, economic voting, and women in politics. She's just published a fantastic book, Voters Under Pressure, with Oxford, where she argues that group-based cross pressures are really what explains electoral volatility. And today she'll be presenting a joint project entitled How Does Voter Perception Shape Partisanship? Or she'll be presenting Compass. So please remain well covered.
Hey, thank you for that, for the invite, for the introduction. I'm really excited to be here and to share some ongoing work that is part of a larger project that I'm doing with Patrick Fournier, my colleague at University of Montreal, and Zeynep Zomer-Topkou, who's at the University of Texas at Austin. So in this project, we're looking at citizens' perceptions, the perceptions that citizens hold, of where parties are positioned, multiple issues. So we're trying to study this from a multidimensional perspective. And the starting point of the paper that I'm presenting today, and basically the larger project, is that politics is pretty complicated. That politics is pretty complicated for voters, because we're assuming that voters, when they're choosing what candidate or party to vote for, are behaving in a fairly rational way and are able to figure out which party or which candidate will match their interests best. But parties and candidates are taking positions on all sorts of different issues. So if a voter would like to be fully rational, they would have to go through party platforms and figure out parties' positions on all these different issues and get a really nuanced idea of what every single candidate or party stands for. That's way too much to ask to a voter. So voters rely on simple things, on heuristics to help them make sense of politics. And one of those heuristics that we know helps voters make sense of politics, but also helps parties position themselves, is ideology. Ideology meaning that parties have some sort of basic brand ideological position that summarizes what they stand for on all sorts of different issues. Most of the time, when you think about an ideological space, we think of it as a one-dimensional space where voters and parties take positions. Positions going, most of the time, we think about this as a left-right ideological space. And as an example here, I put on the positions of parties according to the Chapel Hill Expert Survey from 2019 in Austria, to illustrate how parties can be positioned in that space. And what we see in Austria is that voters do not have to go through all these party platforms to get a broad sense of party stand for. They just can get a sense of parties' left-right positions and figure out that there's a block of left-wing parties, the Greens and the Social Democrats, and then there's parties to the right. So things are a bit easier for voters to navigate this space. They can get a sense of what their own position is, what their own ideology is, and then figure out if they'd rather vote for a party to the left or for a party to the right. So things get a bit more complicated when we move to a space that we cannot summarize as in a one dimension, on a single dimension. When politics is truly multidimensional, then we're requiring a bit more from voters. If we stick to the Austrian case, for example, we can try to position parties on an economic left-right space, and what you see then is that there's still a block of left-wing parties and a block of right-wing parties. You still have the Greens and the Social Democrats to the left, and then three parties to the right. Note, though, that NEOS, the party that is most right-wing here, wasn't quite to the right as much on the general left-right dimension. When we move to a second dimension, which the Chapel Hill Expert Survey team has referred to as Galtan, so liberal positions versus more authoritarian positions, then you see that NEOS, the party that is the most right-wing on the economy, all of a sudden is amongst the left-wing parties. Now, all of a sudden, NEOS is situated in between the socialists and the Green parties. And we could add more dimensions, and we could see that parties switch around positions or in different blocks, depending on the kinds of issues that we look at. With this space, if there's multiple dimensions of parties switch around, how do people make sense of politics, and what are the features of a system and of parties' positions that help voters make sense of all of this? Well, one thing that has been proposed is that party polarization is going to help voters to make sense of all of this. If they realize that the FPÖ, for example, is a pretty extreme party on European integration, then maybe that's enough for them to make sense of politics. So in one-dimensional space, polarization matters. Perhaps it also matters when they look at different issues. The point that we're making in this project, however, is that if we really want to understand how voters make sense of parties' positions in a multidimensional space, we do not have to, we cannot just look at single dimensions and how extreme or how polarized parties are. We also have to keep in mind the connections between parties' positions on different issues and different dimensions. And that's what we refer to as how ideologically constrained parties are in their positions across a range of issues. So we're thinking about constraint as how ideologically consistent parties' positions are across issues. In the US context, for example, it's been argued that the Republican Party is taking quite consistently conservative positions on issues like social welfare, racial or cultural issues, while the Democratic Party is consistently taking liberal positions on each of these issues. In European countries as well, we find that there's quite some consistency in the sense that parties that tend to take right-wing economic positions also tend to take more authoritarian positions on that second dimension, while more left-wing, economic left-wing parties also tend to take more progressive positions on the second cultural dimension. We think that this constraint, this feature of a party's position and of a party system is going to be important and shape voters' attitudes towards party and how they evaluate parties. To illustrate what we mean with constraint and ideological consistency, again, the Austrian case is an example here. Now, thinking about it on a two-dimensional space, instead of looking at every dimension separately, we can combine the economic left-right dimension and the Galtan dimension. And what we see when we do so is that there's four parties here that are taking pretty consistent positions on those two dimensions. There's parties that are economically right-wing and at the same time take more conservative positions on the second dimension. And then there's parties that are both economically left-wing as well as more progressive. The exception is NEOS. So NEOS is a party that we would refer to in our project as a party that lacks this ideological constraint. Between countries and between party systems, there's quite some variation in how much ideological consistency and constraint there is and how parties are spread across the space. Sticking to two-dimensional framework, we can contrast the Netherlands, where there's, for starters, there's lots of parties, but also there's lots of parties that are taking these inconsistent positions. Parties that are economically right-wing, but also progressive. Parties that are economically left-wing, but also tend to be more authoritarian. Contrast is with the Spanish context, where you could basically summarize the whole party system by means of a single dimension. If you're trying to figure out where a party stands on the second dimension, then you can just consider its position on the first dimension, and that's going to be predictive of its position on the second dimension. This ideological constraint, we argue in the project and we seek to test, is going to be important for the attitudes that voters form vis-a-vis parties. Why does this matter? Because when there's lots of constraint, that basically means that things are really simple for voters. It means that the positions of a party on one issue are going to be predictive of the party's positions on the second dimension. And simple left-right arguments and ideological cues are still going to be useful. In our previous work with the same team of authors, we have found that this constraint, or the extent to which there's constraint in party systems and there's constraint in the specific party's ideological positions, is connected with how strong partisanship is. So there seems to be a connection between constraint and support for parties. We found that in a two-dimensional space, so focusing on economic left-right positions and the Galtan, the second dimension, we found that in settings like the Netherlands, I just showed you, there's fewer partisans than in settings that look more like Spain or the Spanish context. We also found that parties that are more ideologically inconsistent, party like NEOS in the Austrian case, has a smaller partisan base than parties that are taking these consistent positions. but there seems to be a connection between inconsistency and support for parties. So we studied that using existing data from the European Social Survey that we connected to Chapel Hill expert survey estimates of where parties are positioned. And doing so, we found that, just to show you here, in party systems settings, where there's more inconsistency, there's a smaller number of people that identify as partisan. So settings like the Netherlands, there's fewer partisans than settings like Spain. And focusing on individual parties, we also found that parties that take more inconsistent positions, again, a party like NEOS, tends to have a smaller partisan base than parties that take consistent positions. So that's what we previously found, but that study was limited in a number of ways. For starters, we were limited to studying inconsistency on these two broad dimensions. So basically only focusing on does a party's economic left-right position match their position on the second Galton dimension? And that was all we could measure. Secondly, we relied on expert placements of where parties are positioned to determine if a party is inconsistent or not, without having an ability to test whether voters actually see things in the same way, whether a party like NEOS is perceived as inconsistent by voters as well. So with this project, we want to address those limitations. First of all, expand measures of inconsistency to capture more than two dimensions and look at different issues and see to what extent parties' positions on one issue are predictive of its positions on other issues. And we also want to capture what is going on at the individual level by collecting data on citizens' perceptions of parties' positions. And specifically, we seek to figure out what individual level mechanism explains why parties that are more inconsistent have fewer supporters. There's a few possibilities that could explain why a party like NEOS, again in the Austrian example, has fewer partisans than parties that are taking these consistent positions. The first possibility is that a party like NEOS is just in a very unpopular place in the partisan space. It's all about proximity, that there's just fewer voters in this space where NEOS is, and that explains why that party has fewer partisans. If that would be the case, then it's nothing than what we found previously. That has nothing to do with inconsistency per se. It's just that the party is at an unpopular place. A second possibility is that the inconsistency by itself matters too. And the first way in which inconsistency matters is that it's going to lead voters or citizens in general to be more uncertain about what a party really stands for. So voters will not be quite sure what a party like NEOS stands for because it's taking these inconsistent positions. It's asking more to voters to figure out what a party really stands for. If there's uncertainty, then a voter is not going to develop an attachment to that party. The third possibility is that voters just dislike parties that are lacking constraint, parties that are taking inconsistent positions. So in the paper I'm presenting today, we're focusing on testing the last two mechanisms. So figuring out if inconsistency by itself has some sort of effect. We're accounting for the role of positions. And at the very end, I'll try to bring things together and to get an assessment of the relative importance of each of these three mechanisms in connecting inconsistency from parties and support for parties. So focusing on the last two mechanisms, we'll start with the effects on information. Thus, is an inconsistency or a lack of constraint cause burden for citizens in the sense that they have a harder time figuring out what a party really stands for. We test two aspects of a lack of information. The first is that parties that take more inconsistent positions, that voters will be more likely, or respondents in our surveys in the end, will be more likely to indicate that they do not know what the party's position is on a specific issue. So the more inconsistent, the higher the likelihood that a voter for a specific issue, any of the issues, will say, I don't know what the party's position is. Well, for parties that are taking really consistent positions, it's going to be easier for voters to identify what a party stands for. Second thing that we're testing is whether there's a larger gap between the perceptions of voters and those of experts, because we're also running an expert survey. for parties that are taking inconsistent positions. So where there's more error in voters' perceptions of parties that are taking more nuanced, if you will, inconsistent positions. And then we're also checking if there's some dislike for parties that are taking inconsistent positions. To test these possibilities and these expectations, we're collecting survey data, public opinion survey data from 11 countries. We currently have 7 of the countries done, but we're still collecting more data on 4 more countries. In each of those surveys, we ask respondents to indicate their perceptions of where parties position on 6 different issues. We have income redistribution, government intervention in the economy, immigration, climate change, gay rights, and international trade. Our goal here was to cover both the economic dimension and the second cultural dimension, with both items that capture social issues as well as immigration. So voters are asked to indicate their perception of parties' positions. They're also asked to indicate their own position on that same issue. And in parallel, we asked experts to rate all parties on those same issues as well. So we have an objective measure of where parties' positions, according to our experts, and then we have the perceptions of voters of those positions. When we started off this project, we had not planned to do expert surveys. We were initially planning on just combining Chapel Hill expert survey data with voter survey data, but we quickly realized that Chapel Hill expert surveys include pretty tough concepts that we cannot include in a survey for voters. So instead, we developed an instrument that voters are able to use and to respond to, and then are asking the exact same questions to our experts. And then we have some additional variables in there that we can use as controls. Just to show you what these questions look like, they'll have a very similar structure. Each of these items goes from 0 to 10, where there's a less versus more on the ends of the scale. So for example, for income redistribution, some people think that the country should do less to reduce the income gap between the rich and the poor. Other things that the country should do more. Where would you place the political parties on the scale where 0 means that the country should do much less, and 10 means that it should do much more? And we structured all these questions in a very similar ways. For example, government intervention in the economy, immigration. Does the party think that the country should allow much fewer immigrants versus much more? Climate change, or gay rights, and then finally international trade. So we've got 6 issues, and we're measuring people's own positions on these issues, the perceptions of where parties are positioned, and then experts are doing the same exercise. Using these data that we've collected, we then try to capture inconsistency, so a lack of constraint in parties' positions. In our previous work, we did this focusing on just 2 dimensions, economic left-right versus Galtan, and we just looked at the difference that there is in the party's position with economic left-right versus Galtan. When we're looking at 6 different issues, things get a bit more complicated. So we ended up developing an instrument that is basically looking at the standard deviation of a party's perceived position across the 6 issues, where we've coded all of these items so that higher numbers, higher values correspond to more right-wing or more conservative positions. As an illustration, again, putting up the Austrian case, this is where experts positioned the different parties on 5 over 6 different issues. And you can see that for NEOS, there's a much wider range of positions across the 5 different issues here than there is for example, the FOPU. So NEOS will have a larger standard deviation in its positions across the issues than the FOPU. NEOS is a more inconsistent party than the FOPU. That's our main measure, the standard deviation in parties' positions across a range of issues. We also developed a measure that is more similar to what we used in our previous work, that is basically combining positions on the economic issues to have an economic left-right position, and then combining the information or the positions on the other issues to have a Galtan dimension, and just looking at the difference on those dimensions. And then we also have a measure where we excluded one of the 6 issues, international trade, because we realized that the international trade one is the toughest both for experts as well as for voters to use and to position parties on. outcome measures. First, to study the impact on information, we're looking at indicating that a respondent does not know a position of a party, which was an explicit option that we introduced for all of these items. And then the error that there is between where a respondent positions a party and where experts position that party. Our outcome variable is going to be like dislike ratings on 0-10 scale. So higher values indicate that people like the party more. On to the results. So we'll start off with the connection that there is between inconsistency, a lack of constraint in a party's position, and information. So we'll focus on lack of constraint according to our experts. So the experts rate a party like NEOS as being very inconsistent. And how does that correlate with measures of voters' level of information about those parties' positions across the issues? What we see is that a lack of constraint, a party that takes more inconsistent position, is associated with a higher share of don't knows on the party's positions on the issue. So a party that has a position that is 1 standard deviation more inconsistent increases the share of don't knows on a specific issue by 2%. We also see that there's more error in the positions in the perceptions of parties' positions for parties that are more inconsistent. So a party that is 1 standard deviation more inconsistent, there will be on average per issue 0.5 point more error in where a voter perceives that party to be versus expert than there is for a party that is less inconsistent. So this is an analysis at the party level. So far, we have 7 countries. We have 41 parties in the data set for now, but we're already seeing a connection between whether parties perceived as being inconsistent and the level of information that voters hold about those parties.
Just wondering whether inconsistency is correlated with the age of the party, like NEOS has been around since 2014. Is that a general pattern? Because it would seem like people would be less likely to know about a new party.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in this set of analysis, we haven't controlled for party age. In our previous work, we did add a control for party age, and that didn't. The effects of inconsistency still hold when we account for that. I'm not sure what the direct effect of party age in those models was. We can also move to the individual level and study this association between the party being more inconsistent and voters' level of information about the party's positions captured through don't knows or error in their perceptions of parties' positions. The advantage of that is that we can look at heterogeneity between voters and whether this lack of constraint is particularly affecting some voters more than others. What we see is that there's an interaction with political interest, self-reported interest in politics. What this means is that, for example, for don't knows, that the share of don't knows, that a 1 standard deviation increase in inconsistency in a party's positions leads to about 4 percentage points increase in the share of don't knows among those who are not at all interested in politics, while the effect is much smaller amongst those who are very interested in politics. And we see a similar sort of pattern when we focus on perceptual error. Again, the effects are most pronounced among voters who are not at all interested in politics. So to sum up this part of the result, we see that citizens are less knowledgeable about positions of parties that take more inconsistent positions. And we see that because they're more likely to say that they do not know what a party's position is on a specific issue, and because there's larger error when they do indicate what they think is the perception or the position of a party, there's more error in those perceptions. And these effects are stronger among the least politically sophisticated. Moving to our second set of analysis. So we've established that there's a connection between constraint and information. Second question is, well, is there some distaste for inconsistency in parties' positions? So here we'll be focusing on when voters perceive a party to be more inconsistent, they like that party less. I'll start by saying that the perceptions that voters hold about inconsistency correlate not super strongly, but positively with experts' perceptions of inconsistency. So that parties that, according to our experts, are more inconsistent also tend to be the parties that voters think of as more inconsistent. As you'll see, this association is far from perfect, and there's quite some parties that, according to our experts, are really inconsistent, but voters do not see the same level of inconsistency, like the small populist party in Canada, PPC. But our focus is on citizens' perceptions here. So is there a connection between voters perceiving a party to be more inconsistent and the rating of that party on the 0-10 like-dislike scale? Seems that there is, across a range of models with different sorts of controls. You consistently find a negative and significant effect of inconsistency on party effect, like-dislike ratings here. In the first model, it's basically by varied estimate. The only thing we account for are the differences between countries with country fixed effects. In the second step, we add a control for perceiving a party to take really extreme positions on issues. Extremity might be correlated with inconsistency, but we know that voters do not like very extreme parties, so you account for that, and that doesn't affect our estimate. In the third step, we also account for the proximity that voters perceive between themselves and where the party is positioned. If those inconsistent parties are perceived to be really far away, then maybe that is what is driving the dislike. It reduces the coefficient a bit, but not a huge amount. Next step, we add party fixed effects to account for parties' positions on all of these issues. And in the final step, we also include individual fixed effects, accounting in this model both for all parties' positions on these 6 issues, all voters' positions on all of these issues. And doing so, we still find that when a voter perceives a party to be more inconsistent, the voter or the respondent likes that party less. And this is what the effects looks like based on the estimates from model 4 here. Pretty steep effect, so that a party that is perceived as being perfectly consistent, so holds the exact same value across the 6 different issues, that party on average will get a like-dislike rating of 5.5, which is reduced to less than 3.5 for parties that are perceived as the most inconsistent parties in our data set. These effects are really robust across the different countries for which we've got data at this point. So really similar effects in Austria, Canada, France, Germany, Great Britain, Ireland, and the United States. There's variation in the precision of these effects, but we quite consistently find that there is this association between perceiving inconsistency and disliking a party. This holds for different ways of operationalizing inconsistency. So if you look at this in a 2-dimensional framework, find the same thing. It also holds when we remove the international trade item. As an additional test, we also consider inconsistency just on issues that are important for a voter. You could argue that inconsistency across 6 issues should not bother a respondent who doesn't care about half of those issues. So we did a test where we were only focusing on the top 2 rated issues for a voter that they found personally most important among the 6 issues. And when we do that and capture the distance between the parties' perceived positions on those 2 issues, then we find still find a negative effect, though it's somewhat reduced. Importantly, we do not find that voters who themselves taking more inconsistent positions appreciate inconsistency more. As soon as we account for proximity between citizens and parties, for sure this, well, I'll show you basically. initially there is a significant interaction between a respondent being more inconsistent and the respondent perceiving a party to be more inconsistent, but that is entirely driven by just proximity. As soon as we account for the positions of parties, that interaction disappears. So a voter that is, say, in the same quadrant as Neos is will not appreciate or like a party that is in the opposite quadrant more. It's only proximity that is driving those effects and not some appreciation of the complexity of politics, it seems. All right. So our main conclusion so far is that inconsistency matters and seems to affect voters. In two main ways. We see that inconsistency leads to lower levels of information about parties' positions. And we also find that there's some distaste for inconsistency among voters. Overall, this leads to voters disliking inconsistent parties more. So parties that lack constraint, that are more inconsistent on average, are less popular across our sample of countries and across the parties from which we got information. So if you look at, moving back to experts' perceptions of where a party is positioned, the parties where experts think that they are really inconsistent are also the parties that are less liked on average. So I started off with mentioning that there's three potential mechanisms that might explain all of this. There's the positions of parties and voters. It can be all about proximity. It can be that voters are less informed, and we know that they are indeed less informed about inconsistent parties. And it can be that they dislike, that they have a distaste for inconsistency. We found some evidence that these mechanisms are plausible. Now the question is, how important are they in the bigger picture? To what extent do these mechanisms explain the lower levels of support for more inconsistent parties? So we do a decomposition analysis to see what explains this negative association between experts perceiving a party as more inconsistent and the average level of support effect for a party. On average, there's a negative association. So parties that our experts think are more inconsistent are less liked. The direct effect of that is a lot smaller than the indirect effect. So most of this effect is mediated through different mechanisms. Our indicator of voters' perceptions of inconsistency contributes between 10 and 15% to this total effect. So the distaste for inconsistency matters and helps us to explain somewhat, limited extent, the average effect that we find here. Distance is the big thing, and that distance by itself explains more than the total effect. In fact, more than the total effect, because perceptual error in where voters are positioned contributes negatively to explaining this effect. What this all means is that if voters were perfectly informed about the positions of inconsistent parties, they would like them less than they currently do. So the lag of information about parties' positions helps those inconsistent parties reduce the punishment that they would otherwise get for inconsistency. Because those positions tend to be really unpopular overall. To sum up, in a multidimensional space, we started off by saying that the connection between parties' positions across issues is going to be important and shape how voters view parties through mechanisms of information and through an effective mechanism that is disliking those sorts of parties. If we try to figure out why it is that these parties are less popular, then definitely proximity is a big part of the story. But it's not the only part of the story. These perceptual errors matter a great deal as well. And again, those inconsistent parties would have even less support if voters were fully informed about where those parties were positioned. On top of all of that, voters that perceive parties to be more inconsistent also dislike it when they see it. This is where we're sort of still collecting data, so there's a lot more that we have to do in this project. So it's still early stages, and there's still a lot that we can change and adapt. not really to the survey instrument, because we want it to be consistent across countries, but still any suggestions on how to move forward would be really appreciated. So we're still collecting data on 4 more countries, 2 Scandinavian countries, 2 countries inside of Europe. That is the next thing that we'll do in this project. And there's more things that we're thinking about. First is to think about this measure of inconsistency a bit more and figure out if there's other ways to operationalize this. The main limitation of our measure is that it makes the assumption that economically right-wing positions match with more conservative positions, which is an assumption that we think is plausible in most of the countries that we're studying. But there might be ways to get around that and to capture the dimensionality of the space without making that assumption that of what goes with what, basically. Jelle Kudam and colleagues have developed an indicator that that we'll probably integrate in the project to get around that problem. With the data set that we have, we'll have, with 4 more countries, even more variation at the party level, which will hopefully get us some leverage to figure out if there's party level factors here that are really important, and to figure out whether some parties can avoid punishment for inconsistency more than others, and if so, what is helping them do that. Finally, and importantly, so far this part of the project is entirely observational, and we're collecting survey data to look at those perceptions that voters hold of party positions, but we're limited in terms of causal inference. So a next step will be to collect more data through a number of survey experiments in a more limited number of countries, where we will be manipulating constraint and see how voters react to that as well. Thank you, and look forward to seeing you.
Yeah, thank you. This was really interesting. So I have a bunch of questions, but I wanna like think more about like this idea of inconsistency, because I'm having a hard time like understanding what that exactly means. So I think I have like 3 related questions to, or like sub questions that like tap into this. First, like on like one of the last slides, you talked about, you know, these might like be unpopular kind of like policy platforms. But I'm not really sure, like, you know, if this is, I mean, how we think about unpopularity or popularity here, because, you know, if like like there are some parties on kind of like the diagonal line already, right? Like, you know, if you want to like start a new party, like you have to differentiate yourself a little bit from that. So, and given that these parties have been elected, it kind of like suggests that, you know, for a subset of voters, these parties are quite popular, otherwise they wouldn't get elected, right? And then throughout your talk, I was like really wondering, like, how this maps onto this party size. Like, you know, the smaller the party, like, you know, probably like on the off diagonals, you have like smaller voter blocks. So that just like means that these parties are like probably not as strong, which means like more people are like opposed to this party, which might like explain some of your results. I think like early on you mentioned that you had looked into that, but I wasn't entirely I'm sure like how you addressed that. And then I was really trying to understand or like imagine how voters actually like think about this inconsistency. So say like you have a party that, you know, is like more to the right on one dimension, more to the left on another. So say like it's very like kind of like free market, economically conservative, you want to call it like, but like very socially liberal, right? Do voters actually find that weird because, you know, we as academics assign like high values on the one dimension and low values on the other one? And is there like any evidence that voters actually find that weird?
Thanks for those. I answered right. Okay. Thanks for this question. I'll start with the first one. When I say those positions are unpopular, it is because there's fewer people in that space, or in those areas of the political space. That does imply and that we know that the parties that are there tend to have smaller vote shares. For sure, in a proportional system, that might be perfectly fine for a party, but in the bigger picture, that means that there's less sort of growth potential for parties that are situated there. They sure can get into parliament and get votes, but it's going to be really hard for them to be the first party because there's not a whole lot of people over there. At least if we assume that people's positions are fixed. Then do voters find inconsistency weird? That we don't know. Maybe the experiments can give us some leverage there and help us to sort of capture voters' intuitive reactions to that. The only thing we know based on what we've got is that they're less informed about those parties. They don't know, or they're less likely to know where those parties are exactly positioned, which might signal more confusion about a party. Do they find it weird per se? That's hard to tell.
I was just going to ask one question. If you look at a lot of these radical right parties in Europe, a lot of them have moved to the left on economic issues. Like in France, in Belgium, and voters don't seem to have any problems with them. I mean, if anything, they become more popular. So is that because for some reason voters don't perceive that inconsistency, or are they aware of it but they don't care because it's their favorite populist leader or something like
Right,
that?
the people who hate them really hate them a lot, and that's what's being.
Yeah.
Right. So that's why I was mentioning that we need more to sort of look at the party level and what's going on there. And there's some parties that get away with it more. What I can say is that based on our previous paper, we found that those effects were mostly driven by parties that are economically right-wing and liberal, so progressive. So it's mostly your sort of typical liberal party that is driving the negative effects, and not so much the radical right parties. That might be because those parties are not showing their inconsistency as much to voters. That because they're mostly focusing on immigration anyways, voters are not really aware of that inconsistency, and hence they're not getting punished for that as much. It's an assumption or sort of a hypothesis that I'm putting out here. We'll hopefully be able to explore the data a bit more to figure out if that is indeed what we find. The fact that those parties have recently shifted to the left might also be a reason why the effects aren't quite trickling down as much yet.
So I'm sort of wondering about, you alluded to the economic dimension and the role that it plays, because I'm thinking both theoretically and empirically, there might be reasons to play with this, right? Theoretically, it's Kitchell's whole idea of sort of the shifting sort of dimensions of an alignment of parties on economic versus cultural dimensions. But empirically, just like a toy example would be, a libertarian party is pro-free market and pro-gay rights. A conservative party is pro-free market and anti-gay rights. Yet both are entirely consistent, a priori, right? There's consistent with their sort of past commitments. So I guess I'm wondering, sort of, is this all being driven by sort of a specification of the economic dimension? Is there sort of different ways to play with it, and what do you account for what drives consistency, basically?
I'll start by saying that the way that we operationalize things doesn't seem to matter much. We find it quite consistently. So our main approach is to look at these 6 different issues that include some economic issues, but it's not limited to economic issues. So really across the range of different issues, we find an effect there when we limit it to just a distinction between economic positions and non-economic positions. The effects are basically the same. The sort of the bigger point in your comment though is sort of what is inconsistency, and is a libertarian position, is that really inconsistent? Voters seem to dislike those positions. Do they dislike it because they perceive it as weird, as was raised previously, or do they dislike it for all sorts of other reasons that we don't quite know yet? I think the main way to get around this will be to get at a measure of just dimensionality of the space, rather than making this assumption that a party that is economically right-wing ought to be more conservative. Across the countries that we've got, the party space seems to be mostly structured in a way that there is a positive correlation between parties' economic positions and their positions on the second dimension. But there's some other parties there too, but those off diagonals are less populated by parties. So that might result in voters being used to seeing an association between being more economically right-wing and more conservative.
So it gets back to the party age.
Yeah.
two questions, one in methodology and the other in the data. The methodology is about, so the main assumption is that any party has an ubiquitous position, while recently, at least in the last 6-8 years, one of the biggest fear is that after Cambridge Analytica, after the creation of a small WhatsApp group, country level or town level, to talk about politics, and now with chatbot, is that the interaction between parties and voters is much more personalized. And so also the perception of the political stance get fragmented. And I don't know if this in the methodology or in the questioning was considered or was a problem. And the other aspect is on the data, because I have the feeling that if you consider additional data, who are the party that are in government and which are in the position, it will show that perhaps ambiguity is a luxury for opposition. Instead, is a curse for governing party. I wonder if this metadata was considered.
Thank you. For the first point, we assume that a party has one position and that information on that party's position is going to be spread out across voters. Whether that for sure there will be some aggregate correlation between a party's real position and perceptions. I think there might be a lot of heterogeneity based on voters' own characteristics, and some voters are just going to be more or less informed about politics in general, and hence about parties' positions too. And then the mechanism that you're referring to, that parties might be purposefully having sort of different messages for different populations. I think the measures that we have in the survey are too limited to any sorts of tests where we can figure that out. And we would need to have pretty good measures also that capture those tailored messages from parties and know exactly which groups they're tailoring with different messages. I would assume though that that tailoring happens maybe more on precise issues than on these sort of really big issues, that there's going to be a bit less tailoring on a position on sort of the role of the government in the economy, for example. The tailoring is going to be on more specific policies, I would assume, than on sort of bigger picture issues. For government and opposition, again, I think that the way that we're measuring positions is seeking to capture pretty fixed positions of parties. Parties can move around a bit, but they cannot sort of completely alter their positions on, for example, immigration, depending on whether in government or opposition. Again, there might be some nuance there, but I think we're focusing on pretty big issues for which there's supposedly a bit more stability in parties' positions as well. For sure, there's other ways in which parties can communicate to blur their positions, or to send a signal that there's more ambiguity about the position than what we're capturing. That blurring and ambiguity, I would suspect, will probably correlate with inconsistency somewhat, but not that strongly, I would guess. A party that is, according to our assumptions, more inconsistent can be more or less ambiguous about that inconsistency. And coming back to the radical right, for example, we would position most radical right parties as pretty inconsistent if they're economically left-wing, but they can be more or less ambiguous about their positions on some of these issues, but the inconsistency still holds.
So yeah, following up on that, a nice thing to do would be to try to disentangle heterogeneity of perceptions on each individual issue dimension from the overall constraint. And also maybe, I think the great thing about what you're doing is that you have that everything is multidimensional. But it'd be nice to know, well, what happens if we do kind of use an old-fashioned unidimensional approach? And I hope maybe you asked just the traditional 10-point, where do you place yourself? Because I would be curious to know if you just took the heterogeneity and the perceptions of that, like the standard deviation, either from the experts or from the voters or both, the standard deviation on that, how does, just made a scatter plot of that and your measure of inconsistency, that would be an interesting thing to know. Like, is this, do the people also just kind of just not know who these parties are? And it's kind of, I ask because it's very, for my own interest in this, like I have some work I'm doing with Gary Cox on just the idea of perceptions of within party heterogeneity. And we also find that people don't like heterogeneous parties, but we're working in one dimensional. We're using the CSES where we just have that simple question. So you've got much more complexity here. But it'd also be nice, like issue by issue, to know what those standard deviations are. I guess my guess is that the standard deviation is just going to be higher for these parties that are not constrained. So it's not like everybody knows exactly where they are on each of these issues and they just don't like it. It might also be that because they are off diagonal, people are more unsure of what they actually. I mean, that's part of what you're finding, right? Is that they don't know where they are. So I think it's you have the data to kind of really disentangle that in a nice way, I think.
That's a great solution. I would guess that the parties that are expert rate is more inconsistent, that there is larger standard deviations in the left-right positions on the general left-right scale, which indeed we also have. So both in the expert surveys and the voter surveys. We haven't used that dimension much so far because we're focusing on that multidimensionality, but it makes total sense.
To tell us like what other papers have people written that are wrong because they don't have the data that you have, like if we approach the world like everybody always has, one dimensional. How do we, what inferences will we draw that are different than what we can now draw in a multidimensional world?
Like Roden and Cox 224, right? That's
we think about things in a multidimensional way. We don't have the data.
There's a great suggestion.
And you'll pay a steep price for it. Hans, you had another question?
Yeah, so I've been thinking a little more about, the term weird that I used earlier, and I think a more sophisticated way of putting that would be like, cognitively more challenging, or just, kind of like requiring more cognitive capacity to rate these parties. So I've been like trying to think about how one could measure that. And so one idea that I had, if you run another survey, is to ask respondents to describe in their own words what parties stand for, and then measure like either just the number of characters that they spend, or probably ideally the number of seconds they spend on that divided by the number of characters. So like, just they think more to come up with an answer, holding the length of the answer fixed.
That's great. We have one open-ended question that goes in that direction in there, but it's about the party space in general. It's not for specific parties. So this would require having a similar question for every single party so that we can compare parties. The only thing that we've got in there is an open-ended question asking people to indicate what sort of the main issues are that parties disagree on, which at the party system level might correlate with inconsistency as well. Party systems where parties are more spread out across the space, there should be a lot more issues being mentioned than in spaces where it's one-dimensional. But I hadn't thought about the possibility to do that at the party level. That makes total sense. It would eat up a lot of space in the survey.
You have to do it for all parties, right?
That's
If
right.
it's like two parties or so.
Yeah, no, that's a great idea. Thank you.
I guess I have a kind of one bigger question. This was really interesting, but I guess what I think about is that role of kind of this inconsistency and the relation between being inconsistent and being a one-issue party, or the salience of different issues to voters, and especially how that would affect kind of the differences between voter and expert ratings. Because I think they're kind of for expert rating a party would be quite inconsistent. That's that can be a one-issue party and holds kind of more, in some cases, more far-right parties, it's less important for people what they offer economically, though maybe it's important, maybe it is important if they are more kind of for more generous redistribution, but especially when they are a niche party, people vote for them because and know about kind of their anti-immigrant, etc. positions, but then expert would be able to rate them as quite inconsistent. And it would also to me, it would not be intuitive that parties who are kind of more one-issue parties would be penalized for inconsistency. So it seems that people parties will be penalized for inconsistency potentially if they are kind of these long-established parties that have had to take these multiple issue positions and they are kind of vying for actual kind of power office.
Right. Oh, that makes a lot of sense. And again, this might be part of what is going on with the radical right, though. Green parties are sort of single issue parties as well, and they are not at all inconsistent or perceived as inconsistent, neither by experts nor by our voters. So it seems to be that voters are sort of able to sort of get through the complexity of parties' positions for a single issue party like the Greens, but
I guess for the Green Party, the single issue is not on either of the dimensions. No, so as in like being green is not an economic or like a social liberal or conservative dimension fully. Yeah. But I know it's hard to think about it.
Depending on how you define those dimensions. We don't have any measures of sort of voter-based measures of issue ownership, but you can just use established measures, drawing on other surveys and other work to categorize parties potentially in that way and see if there's a connection. I think it might be, and then again, it might be sort of one of the reasons why some parties, even though experts think they're inconsistent, are not punished for that, because voters really think about only one issue when they think about that, and they do not have to go through the.
You have the voter weights, the voter saliences? Did you
for themselves?
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
you have that.
So you
Yeah.
can-
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. So among the 6 issues, they were asked to rate each of the issues on sort of 0 to 10 on how important those issues were to them personally.
And I guess another thing that I thought about, I was thinking about is like how, like you were also saying that this kind of, inconsistency is not really rooted in kind of the politics of a specific country. But I guess like, I mean, one option is to just measure the party's inconsistency relative to the kind of general inconsistency of parties within the country. Just to say that, like parties are on average this inconsistent along these 2 dimensions, or this not consistent in this country. How does this party fare? Of course, like it's kind of with like it's you'd have to make some executive choices. Like, would you be looking at like historical inconsistency? Because I think that's kind of what like could matter to voters. Like historically in this country, like parties have held like similar positions on these 2 dimensions, but now things have been shifting. Or parties are like different relative to that. Because I think that could anchor it more in like the political system.
Yeah, it's sort of getting used to the complexity of the space might be part of that. In the first paper, we played around with that a bit, but we were limited because we don't have a whole lot of countries, and obviously sort of anything that is party system level is also country level, and there's a lot of confounding variables potentially in there. We played around with that a bit, and it seemed that parties or party systems where there was on average more inconsistency, that there was sort of less punishment for inconsistency. Is that really people getting used to it or not? There was an association, and we couldn't do much better than showing that. The sort of with sort of overtime changes in parties' positions that we're seeing, and sort of the work of Kitchell was mentioned. It can also be that we're currently in sort of a phase where there's a lot of inconsistency, but it's going to flip around to some extent, and we'll again be into one-dimensional politics just on the second dimension instead of the first one, and things will get sort of easy again for voters potentially. But at this point, we see that both dimensions still matter a great deal, and hence some people have challenges dealing with that complexity.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Did you find that any of the dimensions were especially influential in generating this kind of inconsistency? Or is there a dimension in which parties are especially likely to outlie your opinions?
I don't know. We were concerned that the trade issue was doing that, just because the trade issue was just a really hard one to answer for everyone, and so leaving that one out did not sort of change the measures drastically. But we can play around more with different combinations of and see if there's, well, in general, I'd say that the standard deviations in parties' positions across the different issues are all fairly similar. So there isn't one that really stands out a great deal.
We are out of time, and thank you very much for a fantastic presentation and a great conversation.